welcome to First Chapter Fridays. Today we are going to read number 13 of the Nancy Drew Clue Book, and this is by Carolyn Keene and illustrated by Peter Francis. The name of number 13 is Puppy Love Prank. Puppy Love Prank. It's published by Aladdin. And we are reading Chapter 1, Tail Wagging Wedding. Stop! Bess Marvin shouted as she came to a halt. We forgot something super important. Nancy Drew stopped walking too. So did her other best friend, George Fane. All three girls were carrying plastic bins filled with treats for the wedding they were going to today. We didn't forget to dress up for the wedding, Nancy told Bess. We're both wearing party dresses and George is wearing a button-up shirt. Yes, but every wedding has something old, something new, something borrowed, and something blue, Bess explained. We don't have any of those. George raised a foot and said, My sneakers are old. Bess rolled her eyes at George's grubby, frayed sneaker. That's for sure, she sighed. And I'm wearing Hannah's sparkly poodle pin, Nancy said. That's borrowed. Your dress is new, Bess, George said, like everything else you wear. Very funny, Bess said with a smirk. Nancy giggled. She had known Bess and George forever, but still couldn't believe they were cousins. Bess washed her long blonde hair almost every morning, painted her nails pink, and had a closet filled with style and clothes. The only time George trimmed her nails was when they grew too long for her computer keyboard or softball catcher's mitt. Just like Nancy, Bess and George were great at solving mysteries. That's why all three friends had their own detective club called the Clue Crew. Nancy even had a special notebook where she wrote down all of their suspects and clues. We need something blue, you guys, Bess insisted. It's a wedding tradition. George's dark curls bounced as she shook her head. It's a dog wedding, Bess, she pointed out. There's nothing traditional about that. Nancy, Bess, and George stood outside Mayor Strong's mansion where the dog wedding would take place. Getting married were Helga and Horatio, the fluffy white bitchen Frise of Mrs. Ainsworth, the richest woman in River Heights. And let's not forget the main reason for this wedding, Nancy said, to let everyone know about the pet shelter Wagamuffins and all the dogs who need homes. And because my mom is catering the wedding, George said proudly, we get to walk 3 of those dogs down the aisle as bride's mutts. How cool is that? It would be even cooler, Bess sighed, if we could find something blue. Nancy, Bess, and George carried the bins filled with doggy cupcakes up the path to the mayor's mansion. Mrs. Fane and her staff unloaded the catering truck to one side of the driveway. When Mrs. Fane saw the girls, she smiled. Thanks for bringing the cupcakes, girls, she said. You can put the bins on the rolling cart. Good, George said with a grin. These cupcakes may be for dogs, but there's enough to feed 10 elephants. Where are Helga and Horatio, Mrs. Fane? Nancy asked while stacking the bins. We'd love to meet them before the wedding. Mayor Strong arranged a special room for the dogs, Mrs. Fane said, pointing to a door at the back of the house. It even has its own entrance. Mrs. Fane returned to her work and the girls turned toward the door. Nancy brushed aside her reddish blonde bangs to read a sign on the door. It read, Private. Now, we can't go inside the room to meet Helga and Horatio, Nancy said, disappointed. Who says we can't? George asked. She walked to the rolling cart, grabbed 2 cupcakes, and said, Special delivery for Helga and Horatio. Nancy knocked 3 times on the door. They waited until a woman's voice called, "Enter!" Bess opened the door. As they stepped inside, the girls looked around the room. The first things they noticed were a doggy-sized wedding dress and tuxedo hanging on a rack. Standing by the rack and waving a steamer was a boy of about 9 or 10. A silver-haired woman sat on a velvet throne-like chair holding 2 fluffy white dogs. "You missed a wrinkle on the left suspender, Ludlow," she told the boy. "Keep steaming, please." "Yes, Grandma," Ludlow replied. Nancy guessed the woman was Mrs. Ainsworth. The dogs had to be Helga and Horatio. "Hello, Mrs. Ainsworth," Nancy said. "We've come with cupcakes for the happy couple." "They're cupcakes for baked dogs." "Not these dogs," Mrs. Ainsworth cut in. "What would my babies do if they got cream on their clean fur?" "They'd lick it off," George said with a shrug. "They're dogs, right?" Mrs. Ainsworth didn't laugh, but Ludlow did. He blushed when he noticed Nancy, Bess, and George looking his way. "Do you go to River Heights Elementary School?" Nancy asked nicely. "You don't look familiar." "That's because I live in the next town," Ludlow said, turning off the steamer. "I'm helping my grandmother with the wedding. And making sure my babies stay perfectly groomed on their big day," Mrs. Ainsworth added. "Did someone say groomed?" a voice piped in. Nancy, Bess, and George turned to see a couple at the door. Each wore a crisp smock over tailored pants. They carried brand tote bags over their shoulders. "And you are?" Mrs. Ainsworth asked. "I'm Kelly Davis, and this is my husband, Kevin," the woman said, "better known as the Va-Va Groom Glam Squad." "I know what a glam squad is," Bess said excitedly. "You make people beautiful, right?" "We make dogs beautiful," Kevin stated. "Va-Va Groom is a fancy new dog salon on Main Street," Kelly added. "I heard about Va-Va Groom," Nancy said. "It's way too fancy for my dog Chip." In a flash, Kelly handed Nancy a piece of paper and said, "Take this coupon. It's for $20 off a soothing sports podicure, including tax and tip." "Podicure?" Nancy asked. "Now," Kelly said, smiling at Helga and Horatio, "where do we begin?" "By leaving, please," Mrs. Ainsworth said. "I never called for groomers." "That's because I did," Mayor Strong boomed as he burst into the room following a huge hairy dog. "For my dog, Huey." Nancy wanted to squeeze her nose but didn't. Huey smelled a bit ewy. Meanwhile, the glam squad stared at the mayor's dog. "Would your dog like a soothing massage, Mayor Strong?" Kevin asked. "Or colorful stencils on his rather matted fur?" "Nah," Mayor Strong said. "Huey rolled in something stinky. Dig out the dead leaves and whatever else you find in there." The mayor gave his dog a final pat. "Oh, and cleaned the gunk out of his ears, too, so he can hear me whistle." Nancy could tell the glam squad was horrified by the mayor's request. In a panic, the couple turned to Mrs. Ainsworth. "Surely there's something we could do for the bride and groom," Kelly said, instead of Huey. "Please," Kevin squeaked. "I'm afraid not," Mrs. Ainsworth said. "Helga and Horatio were groomed this morning by Mrs. Clippy of Canine Couture." "You mean the celebrity dog groomer to the stars?" Kelly gasped. "His salon is in Chicago." "Mr. Clippy makes house calls," Mrs. Ainsworth said, "in his private helicopter." Nancy could hear Kelly and Kevin growl under their breaths, just like the dogs they groomed. "I'll leave Huey in your good hands," Mayor Strong said, sticking the leash between Kelly's clenched fingers. "See y'all at the wedding." Kelly and Kevin stood frozen as the mayor left the room. George turned to the couple. "Take these for Huey," she said, holding out 2 cupcakes. I'm sure he won't mind frosting on his fur. It would be an improvement, Kevin muttered. Woof, Huey barked. Kelly steered Huey toward the door. On their way out, Nancy heard her say, Kevin, I think we've just been dogged. Nancy didn't know what Kelly meant by that, but she did know one thing. The Bava Groom Glam Squad was mad. Should I shut the door, Grandma? Ludlow asked. Don't bother, dear, Mrs. Ainsworth said. It's 11 o'clock and time for you to walk Helga and Horatio. Nancy, Bess, and George listened to Mrs. Ainsworth give Ludlow special walking instructions. Walk Helga and Horatio for a half an hour away from the guests. Then bring the dogs back to their room for an hour's rest before the wedding at 12:30. While Ludlow fetched the dogs' leashes, Nancy had an idea. Why don't you walk Helga and Horatio in the park across the street, Ludlow? Nancy asked. My dog Chip loves it there. The park? Mrs. Ainsworth demanded. Do my babies look like they chase squirrels? Suddenly, meow! Nancy, Bess, and George rolled around. Standing in the doorway was a cat wearing a ruffled collar and a lacy bonnet. Helga and Horatio growled at the little cat, then leaped off Mrs. Ainsworth's lap. Yelping all the way, the dogs chased the cat out the door. They might not chase squirrels, George exclaimed, pointing outside, but look at them go after that cat. Mrs. Ainsworth jumped up from her chair, wringing her hands. I told Mayor Strong not to invite cats to this wedding. Somebody bring back my babies. And that is the end of chapter 1. And if you'd like to read the book further, you can find the Nancy Drew Clue book, number 13, Puppy Love Prank, at the Deerfield Public Library.